these epidemic events are getting more and more disruptive to health and to economy. And the reason we called it Event 201 is we knew eventually one of these days, one of those events would be the big one. And that big one would really challenge our capacity to respond. And to respond to the big one, we do need to have all hands on deck. Participants are confronted by a hypothetical scenario that presents to them the challenges of a response. So we will say, here's a hypothetical disease outbreak. This is the way it might be evolving. And these are some of the challenges that you'll see that you'll have to address to address the disruptions that you're seeing to your healthcare system or to your organization. All stakeholders realize pretty quickly just how underprepared we are and just how much is possible when we work together. And that the individual actions of any government or company won't add up to a proper global response. I think if we're honest with ourselves, collectively, the international community has never done enough to respond to global health security challenges. That we knew before COVID that the world was underprepared for biological risk. When we walked into the room in New York, if you would have asked, do you think the world is prepared for a pandemic? I think everyone around that table would have said no. But it's when they walked out, I think it's when we really knew that if we are going to get ready, we need to have operationalized and integrated public-private cooperation that we haven't seen before.
It began in healthy-looking pigs, months, perhaps years ago. A new coronavirus spread silently within herds. Gradually, farmers started getting sick. Infected people got a respiratory illness with symptoms ranging from mild flu-like signs to severe pneumonia. The sickest required intensive care. Many died. Experts agree, unless it is quickly controlled, it could lead to a severe pandemic. It could lead to a severe pandemic. It could lead to a severe pandemic, an outbreak that circles the globe and affects people everywhere.
The mission of the Pandemic Emergency Board is to provide recommendations to deal with the major global challenges arising in response to an unfolding pandemic. The board is comprised of highly experienced leaders from business, public health, and civil society.
We could be looking at double the number of cases in 1 week and 16 times as many in a month if we are not able to stop the spread. That would be on the order of 500,000 cases, and it would continue to rise exponentially. In 3 months, we could be approaching 10 million cases.
We're at the start of what's looking like it will be a severe pandemic. And there are problems emerging that can only be solved by global business and governments working together.
We have known about CAPS-like viruses in animals and people for decades, but have not been successful at developing a licensed vaccine. And sure, there are new technologies that may help, but it's going to be difficult. I am not optimistic about having a vaccine in time to be relevant during this pandemic.
So the policy crisis in question for this board in this meeting is this: how should governments, business, and international organizations allocate and distribute pandemic antivirals and medical supplies to the people who need them most?
What we've seen work very well in the HIV field is, in fact, procurement through the Global Fund. So having a centralized mechanism, so financially able to procure on behalf of affected countries would be critical. I think the second thing is it's going to be very important that for the business sector, for manufacturers of antivirals, that we have clarity around what the need is and where the need is and who are making the decisions.
I think that given that the countries most affected are those that are low and middle income countries with unequal access to technology, to finances, the UN has a worldwide footprint, universally recognized, and universal membership.
A global stockpile would certainly help ensure more rational and strategic allocation, but the reality is that we don't have the logistics capability, even within the UN, to bring that together in one place and run it. So this is where I think a collaboration between the international organizations like the World Health Organization and the private sector, which runs these supply chains for many purposes every day, understand where the supplies are, make smart decisions about how to allocate them to the people who need them in the places that need them the most, and then work with the industry to move those supplies from where they are today to where they need to be.
Just to underscore the point that cooperation among supply chain providers or businesses that have huge supply chains can add a lot of efficiency to the whole process.
The question is, can you, through this international mechanism, really promote commitments to doing this as quickly as possible and give people a sense that actually if they contribute more, that they will have a better chance of protecting their own populations and their country's security and health.
So to be completely clear, most of this production would already be committed in contracts.
Yes.
It is almost unheard of that people are producing product without having a forward commitment for the consumption of that product. So the first thing that needs to be done, because this is not something that the countries currently control, unless countries are going to bring about emergency situations and co-opt an existing supply chain.
I think it's not likely, I agree, that countries are not going to buy countermeasure to put into a global supply without retaining a large portion of it for themselves.
Public health agencies have issued travel advisories, while some countries have banned travel from the worst affected areas. As a result, the travel sector is taking a huge hit. Travel bookings are down 45% and many flights have been canceled. A ripple effect is racing through the service sector. Governments that rely on travel and tourism as a large part of their economies are being hit particularly hard.
How should national leaders, businesses, and international organizations balance the risk of worsening disease that would be caused by the continued movement of people around the world against the risks of profound economic consequence of travel and trade bans?
If there's some sense that there's a UN institution that can do all of this, then I worry we're suffering from a delusional disorder on the power of the UN. It's really important to get those industries and their trade associations and an efficient leadership established, which is decentralized, but has a collective responsibility and accountability. And that needs to be supported by the public leadership.
What is essential, what is non-essential travel? We have to clarify this. Otherwise, if we go down to 20% bookings over a long period, the company will run down. That's a fact.
You know, there's a whole complex set of issues in a highly interdependent world on supply chains that are just in time. We need to think about how much flex there is in that just-in-time supply chain system and make sure it keeps running. I think it's going to take specificity, and it's going to take knowledge that only the private sector has. The UN can play an important coordinating facilitation role, but the companies know where those commodities are, where they move, how to move them, and that's where a type of public-private collaboration that we have not generally had in these crises needs to be put together pretty quickly.
We are not out of money yet, but the fact is we are trending in a dangerous direction and something needs to change.
So the policy question for this board now is, how should financial resources be prioritized? Are there nodes that we cannot allow to fail? What is your sense of priorities? We don't have money to pay for all of these urgent problems.
So at the moment, we want the fund, right? You need the money. So where's the money? So government kind of supplies some money. A lot of, private sectors, some are sitting here, you have some money. But now you need a really coordinated, centralized efforts.
Hotels will be experiencing, crippling losses doing that. And we know that the hotel business in itself makes up 5% of the GDP.
Governments need to be willing to do things that are out of their historical perspective, or for the most part, it's really a war footing that we need to be on.
We shouldn't underestimate the power of entrepreneurship. We need to escalate that, whether it's through the government's helping with tax breaks or subsidies of that nature to increase manufacturing of those types of products. It can happen quickly. A Marshall-type plan, don't mean to say that exactly, but a Marshall Plan that can go into effect can stimulate change very quickly. Can stimulate change very quickly. Can stimulate change very quickly.
Countries are reacting in different ways as to how best to manage the overwhelming amounts of dis and misinformation circulating over the internet. In some cases, limited internet shutdowns are being implemented to quell panic.
How much control of information should there be, and by whom? And how can false information be effectively challenged? And what if that false information is coming from companies or from governments?
I think it's very important that we make sure that there is concise communication with all healthcare facilities where these patients are being treated so that there isn't mass panic.
We're at a moment where the social media platforms have to step forward and recognize the moment to assert that they're a technology platform and not a broadcaster is over. They, in fact, have to be a participant in broadcasting accurate information and partnering with the scientific and health communities to counterweight, if not flood the zone of accurate information, because to put the genie back in the bottle of the misinformation and disinformation is nigh impossible.
One thing we haven't spoken about, and I'm wondering whether it's time to talk about this, is a step up from the part of the governments on enforcement actions against fake news.
I personally do not believe that trying to shut things down in terms of information is either practical or desirable. And we do have, I think, a couple of strategies that are available to us, one of which is the flood strategy, second of which is relying and informing and equipping trusted sources of information with the facts so they can then pass that on. But we also need to actually think about a technological answer to this.
The outcome of the CAPS pandemic in Event 201 was catastrophic. 65 million people died in the first 18 months. The outbreak was small at first and initially seemed controllable, but then it started spreading in densely crowded and impoverished neighborhoods of megacities. From that point on, the spread of the disease was explosive. Within 6 months, cases were occurring in nearly every country. The global economy was in a free fall. The GDP down 11%. Stock markets around the world plummeted between 20 and 40% and headed into a downward cycle of fear and low expectation. Businesses were not borrowing, banks were not lending. Everyone was just hoping to hunker down and weather the storm. Economists say the economic turmoil caused by such a pandemic will last for years, perhaps a decade. The societal impacts, the loss of faith in government, the distrust of news, and the breakdown of social cohesion could last even longer. We have to ask, did this need to be so bad? Are there things we could have done in the 5 to 10 years leading up to the pandemic that would have lessened the catastrophic consequences? We believe the answer is yes. So, are we as a global community now finally ready to do the hard work needed to prepare for the next pandemic?
So as you can see, the CAPS pandemic was catastrophic. And as we've said, the impact of a severe pandemic is not only a result of the disease itself, but really the cascading economic and societal consequences that would follow. Now, we don't want to give you the impression that traditional public health measures aren't valuable, because they absolutely are. In fact, in the 200-some outbreaks that WHO responds to each year, interventions such as isolation of the sick, social distancing, disease surveillance, social distancing, disease surveillance, social distancing, disease surveillance. But in a severe, fast-moving pandemic, it may not be possible to contain the spread through these kinds of traditional measures. We think industry and national governments should work with WHO to enhance internationally held stockpiles of MCMs and personal protective equipment so that it could be equitably distributed during a large pandemic. The WHO's existing influenza vaccine virtual stockpile is a good model that could be expanded and augment WHO's ability to distribute vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, other PPE to countries in the greatest need. Countries that would have to support this effort through the provision of additional funding to WHO. Governments should provide more resources and support for the development of surge manufacturing of vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. Countries may need population-level supplies of safe and effective MCMs in a pandemic. So we're therefore really going to have the need to rapidly develop, manufacture, distribute, and dispense large quantities of MCMs. We should increase and reassess pandemic financial support. The World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, regional development banks, national governments, and foundations should explore ways to increase the availability of funds in a pandemic and ensure that they could be flexibly used when they're needed. And finally, governments in the private sector should assign a greater priority to developing methods to combat mis- and disinformation related to pandemic response. Governments will need to partner with traditional and social media in order to research and develop nimble approaches to countering misinformation. For their part, media companies, we believe, should commit to ensuring that authoritative messages are prioritized and really false messages are suppressed.
Be done. If Mike Ryan were here, the gentleman we saw at the outset, he would tell us that the mechanisms to actually do the prevention work, that's very hard to actually get enough funding for that around the world. And if I similarly look, so I chair a body called CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. We are investing in the development of vaccines in the neglected space. For example, MERS vaccines of this kind, the coronavirus. We do not invest enough as a globe in even having the basic options that we could scale up for manufacture. And that's both in the vaccine space, but also in diagnostics, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think putting on this list the financing of both preparedness in a number of countries, but also the technology preparedness, particularly in the vaccines, et cetera.
In this world where there is an abundance of data, is there a way to better coordinate between the public and private sectors in order to capitalize on that data, to learn more and learn it faster and move faster?
I think you've hit on a couple of points that are really important. In an event like this, moving or having a scale of operation larger than we've done for a health event is going to be very important. So it's really outside of the bounds of experience. The other element is to be able to move quickly and at a speed necessary. I think that the opportunity to develop those kinds of mechanisms would be the kind of governance system that we're talking about, that could be part of the agenda for a preparedness activity at a governmental scale. The other thing I would just comment is that an event like this is going to be outside of the health sphere, and so it'll be really important that this not be seen as a health event, but really as a global crisis, and that those parts of government outside of health that are going to be in the lead are leading in this preparedness work as well.
Yeah, I think the data is critical, but I'll use that to segue to another area, if I may, which is the human resource. And a key actor, given that I now have moved to academia, but it is the academic or the training sector. Because if we're really going to develop a surge capacity for something like this, where you're going to have to bring in the reserves, the global health reserves in some respect, it requires an incredible coordination across training institutions, both in terms of pre-service and deployment, how people keep up skills that would be relevant. And that plan won't emerge from global businesses and governments collaborating. It's really got to bring in the higher education sector much more fundamentally, and I would argue with national public health institutes.
I wanted to follow up on the trusted voice idea.
Yeah.
I think everyone around the table spoke about how important it is to find those voices. Do we need to find them now and establish trust in those voices now, so that when the crisis hits, people already have the established trust?
I mean, I would say without question, and because you're in a better position to have built up that bank of goodwill in advance of a crisis. And I'm very intrigued and I think very heartened by the conversation about the identification of community and faith-based leaders in particular, because they do foster enormous trust at a local level.
But there are people who, at this point, probably know very little about pandemic preparedness.
And hence education is necessary.
In advance?
Yes.
I think newsrooms in particular, there's a reason why they have people on the staff, actual former physicians and things, that are constantly talking about different diseases or illnesses that are coming up, so that they continue to build that trust, so that when there is a situation like this, there is already somebody on staff from the medical professional that's a trusted voice, whether it's on any of the networks, that's able to speak up.
Yeah, actually, you made a point earlier about the anti-vaccine movement that's going forward right now, and there was going to be a community event tomorrow in New York City that actually ended up being canceled yesterday because there was only anti-vaccine advocates as a part of a community event, and nobody from the professional medical community would join even in the conversation. So the organizers ultimately, because they were shamed into that imbalance, canceled the event. But it does call out that that's a real issue at the moment that needs to be addressed and should probably serve as a beta, if you will, for this kind of a moment.
Sorry, on this issue of trust, I think there's something that's specific with respect to pandemics, but I think if we look at DRC at the moment, the distrust relates to the health system more generally. We didn't detect the first case in this 10th outbreak for 3 months because health workers were on strike because they weren't being paid. And so I think this community needs to pay particular attention to health systems that have very low levels of public trust, because they then, if you don't have that as a foundation, you're not going to gain it in the context, or it's very difficult to gain in the context of an outbreak. Convinced increasingly that simulations are stimulating, and I think they have a real value, and so I want to make sure that that gets added to the list of recommended actions. I think we have to look and complement that stimulation with a much clearer commitment to driving change in behavior in a very complex system in specific areas. And I think this is helpful, but if we lay this on the 4 reports that were produced following the West Africa crisis, if we link it into the ongoing activities of the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, I think we would come up with an ambitious agenda, but one that gets sufficiently refined that we can begin to hold ourselves accountable to that.
Okay. This side of the table, I'm going to have to ask you to be very brief, but Latoya, go for it.
Yes, to take a look at the takeaways from our history, and we speak of the 1918 flu epidemic and Ebola, basically look at all of the actions that were taken there, bring those together, prepare a regulatory or a protocol that you can start to work on, and try to increase communication from government to government, so we'll be able to share healthcare information, whether it's genome therapy, whatever's taking place, to try to combat the disease or virus.
Okay.
Great. Appreciate the focus on preparedness. As we look at communities that are, let's say, vulnerable to natural disasters or crisis, I mean, we look at trying to foster that community hub, bringing together faith-based organizations, academia, government, small businesses all together. On the other end of the spectrum, we believe that the World Economic Forum is a great platform that brought together post-Ebola a great group of the WHO, the World Food Program led by Henry Schein, J&J, and we are all loosely together because, again, sustainability, keeping the interest of these institutions is always the challenge. Yeah.
I think, first of all, in major global corporations, you know, when you think about even the regulations there are for how many executives can get on one plane at a time, there are all these succession plans already in place. So what are the plans that the global organizations are having in place in case of a situation like this? And then I think the thing I'm surprised about, we didn't bring this into this at all, but politics. If this is taking place from October to December 18th, 2019, with the debates going on and the presidential election coming up in about a year, I think that would play a major part in this kind of scenario.
Interesting point.
For me, my learning was the risk of misinformation and disinformation. I think it requires a lot more thought and coordination across the stakeholders.
At one point, despite the alignment around the room about the importance of some central leadership, I think the challenge in agreeing on the central leadership.
All right. Thank you all. I think summing this up as I see it, investment, planning, preparation, coordinating, prioritization, and obviously all the advanced thought and effort given to those things will hopefully mitigate the effects when the pandemic comes. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
Good.
Thank you, Jean, and thanks to all of our players for these excellent suggestions. Our plan now is to consider your ideas, the results of today, and come forward with a set of recommendations and a call to action. And we hope that with your experience today, you will continue to be amazing champions for this issue. It's extremely valuable, but very rare, for a group of this diversity to come and spend part of the day talking about these issues. So on behalf of our partners at the World Economic Forum and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, I want to thank our players again for their participation and insights today. You did an amazing job in a really difficult scenario. And I also like to thank our broader audience here in New York, as well as those participating online. And of course, our amazing center faculty and staff, and the larger Event 201 team from the Gates Foundation and the World Economic Forum.